All right, everyone, hello and welcome. Today we're going to go over my favorite exercise for training the vertical portions of the lats, specifically the iliac and the costal lats. So what do I mean by the vertical lats? So if we take a look here at Complete Anatomy, I absolutely love this app for looking at all things anatomy, whether it be muscles, ligaments, structure, bones, etc. So I highly recommend this app. Shout out to them. The lower lats are those that run from the hip, right? The iliac portion is the one that attaches right here down to the hip. And the costal portion, if you can see sort of if I zoom in here underneath, are the ones that attach to these lower, 3 to 4 ribs, right? And these are the ones that sort of interdigitate or connect with the external obliques. So the vertical lats, just sort of in general, are the ones that run, not so coincidentally, more vertically. And so in order to train them, what we need to do is we need to do pull-down type motions that are loaded in that same fiber direction. So if you can imagine them running up the ribs and sort of up the side of the body, right, a pull-down type motion that is going to stretch the arm up and overhead is going to be our best bet for training them. So I don't often say favorite exercise. I generally speaking don't have, favorite exercises. But this is one that I just find is very difficult to beat, both in terms of the stability and in terms of the actual stimulus and what we're able to do from an individualization standpoint. I also think that it's very convenient to set up in a vast majority of gyms. So without further ado, I'm just going to let this roll and we're going to kind of make some commentaries on this. So first thing that you'll notice is that when if we look at the lower portions of this video, you can see that I'm actually sitting on a stool, a red stool. These are stools that my gym has. You don't have to actually sit to the side, but we'll see when we look at the second angle here why that's actually important for this particular cable pull down. But this is great because you can basically sit down on any regular pull down machine and do this. Obviously, it's single arm, and a couple of things that we need to talk about first are the actual anchor points or the points of contact, essentially, of the exercise that have nothing to do with the resistance direction, right? Because obviously the resistance direction is in our hand, and that's where we're actively pulling from, but we need to pay attention to the rest of the body. In other words, what we're not trying to move in order to maximize this motion, but really any motion. I think that's a good point to make broadly or talk about broadly, is a lot of times we focus just on what is moving and not enough on what isn't moving. And a lot of times I find that when people make mistakes during exercise, most of the time it's on the stuff that is not supposed to move. If you lock in what's not supposed to move, then what will inevitably be the only thing that can move will, do the work, okay? So when we sit down here, right, and the first thing I want you to notice is I'm pulling with my left arm. My left leg is underneath of this pad and my right hand is on this pole. So why are those things placed in those specific locations? Well, obviously, I need some form of resistance, some form of anchor point against which I can hold myself downward, right? Because the load is trying to pull me up and out of the seat. But I also want an anchor point so that I don't get turned, and we'll see this again from the second angle here in a second. But you want this other hand, this opposite hand, to be able to actually reach the pole. And some people who are shorter, you can actually see, or not necessarily shorter, but have shorter arms, total arm length. We had this little free motion handle actually tied to this portion of the pole, so that those who, when they sit this far back, they can't reach, they actually are able to grab that handle. So that's, if you were wondering why that's there, that's the case. But for me, I can reach, and all you need is a little bit of a contact on your hand. And in this particular instance, when I'm doing my left arm is the working side, what I'm actually doing is I'm actually shoving the pole toward the right. And what that essentially does is it prevents me from getting rotated away from the working arm. And again, I keep referring to this, but when we look at this other angle here from the back, what we'll notice is that the arm, the upper arm specifically, is not actually loaded directly up, sort of out to the side. It's actually loaded slightly up and across my face. Now, the reason is this is the case, and we'll get into this in a little bit more depth in a second here, is specifically because it provides a little bit more stretch on the specific portions of the lats that we're trying to train, the vertical portion of the lats. Now, if we go back to this first angle before we get back to the second one again, I just want to sort of go back to what this knee is doing, what this front leg is doing. With this positioning, a lot of people will actively or sort of passively rather get under there and not actively push up into the pad. You need to make sure, especially as you initiate the pull, if you're going to try to yank it to any degree, you need to really focus on pushing through the floor with this same side leg. Again, because that's going to be the thing that actually holds you down and allows you to pull whatever, cable, machine, whatever the implement happens to be, directly downward rather than just getting pulled up and out of the seat and then having your body weight sort of be the thing that's contributing to then pulling the weight back down. So anchor point number 1 is at the foot, and I'm doing a calf raise essentially actively up into the pad. Anchor point number 2 is the opposite hand, and that opposite hand in this case is pulling to my right. If I was doing my right arm and I was pulling down with my right arm, my left hand would be on it, pulling to the left. Essentially, again, just to prevent you from getting rotated, because one more time, if we go to this other viewpoint, you see that my arm is actually loaded slightly across my body. I'm actually almost leaning over that side to do so. So why do we want to load the arm across? Well, the first thing is just specifically from a comfort standpoint. I personally, before we get into any of the anatomy-based stuff, am a little bit more comfortable loading at an angle that is slightly up and across my face. From an actual anatomy standpoint, you could make the argument that you're loading your clavicle a little bit more directly in the top, as opposed to a little bit less directly. And when I say directly, I mean just in a rotational type fashion. And in addition, if you look at the lats that run on the side of the body, in order to stretch them fully, we actually do need to bring the arms somewhat across the face. So slightly across the face. And another thing you'll notice here, especially from this angle, which is why I took it, is that the arm path is very, very tight to the body. And in addition, that cable is basically just staying parallel to wherever my arm moves the whole time. You can't see it in either of these videos, but this is a rogue pull down. And so what that means is that the pulley on the top doesn't actually pivot. And so what that sort of implies, and part of the reason we have these little stools here, is that if you were to pull it at an angle that was not exactly in line with where the pulley was already angled, you would be sort of creating a friction on the pulley, especially the sides of the pulley, that would then create some sort of bending force on the cable, which would not be good for the machine. So if you're using a machine, point being, that doesn't have a pulley that rotates, make sure that you're really pulling in line with where the pulley already is, because if you're not, you're going to be messing up the machine. Okay, so arm path is narrow, again, to bias more of the lats. If we were to, do a pull down that was less lat specific, we'll call it, which is sort of oxymoronic, like any sort of pull down is going to be involving some degree of lats, right? But the more narrow the arm path, and in addition, from this other angle we can see, the more that the arm sort of stays on the front side of the body, right, sort of in front of what you would technically label the frontal plane of the body, the more lat recruitment we're going to sort of get out of this. Obviously, there will be a ton of teres major recruitment, a ton of rear delt recruitment, and as a consequence, traps, rhomboids, all those associated tissues, but the main limiter of this thing will be the lats. Now, the thing that I have not talked about so far that I think is very, very important, maybe the most important aspect of these pull-down type motions, right? Because we're really not necessarily talking about a single exercise, although I did mention that this is one of my favorite variations, and it is. But we're talking about really more, from a principle-based standpoint, a category of exercise. So what do I mean by that? Well, whether you're doing this in a cable station, or whether you're doing it on a machine, or whether you're doing it on some sort of implement that is a sort of a combination of a cable and a machine, right? There are some machines that are set up as if they're machines and have support like they are, but they're just really just a cable pulley, right? Regardless of whatever we're talking about, we're ultimately just talking about resistance, a direction of resistance, and then specifically our anchor points and how we're sort of relating that resistance to our joints. And so as a consequence of that, what we need to sort of remember is that I'm demonstrating it in this one particular context, but you can essentially mimic this pull down motion in any scenario where you can provide that sort of vertical loading to your body, right? So don't sort of look at this in the narrow window of this is the exercise and this is the only thing that I see, right? Just think about it from a principle-based standpoint, and then you can start to actually apply it across scenarios. So anyway, kind of went tangential there, but what I wanted to mention specifically about lat type motions, specifically these vertical type motions, is that we really need to make sure that we are encouraging motion of the shoulder girdle. So when I say shoulder girdle, that is different from saying shoulder joint, because the shoulder joint is the ball and socket joint, the glenohumeral joint, but the shoulder girdle includes the scapula and the clavicle in addition to the shoulder joint. Those are technically three separate bones. And so what we need to remember is that all of those bones need to move together. And in this specific kind of a pull-down motion, right, or really any pull-down motion, if you want to make that argument, you need to allow that scapula and that clavicle to move upward with the arm. You can think about this kind of like if we look at the top of the motion, you can kind of see that I'm allowing some sort of shrugging type motion toward the top, and that is a controlled shrug. It is not a shrug where I'm being passively yanked into that position. It's a shrug that essentially allows those vertical lats to continue to lengthen as I'm controlling the load and as I am, working into fatigue. And what you'll notice is as the range drops off here, I'm still actually pulling where there's a lot of scapular motion here toward the top. And you see this a lot with guys that just train really hard but don't think too much about training, is they'll get toward the end of the range of motion where they don't really have, much effort left to give, right, where this range starts to drop off, and you'll just sort of see this whole scapular, clavicular, upper arm complex sort of shifting, almost like it's sliding, as opposed to actually, the upper arm rotating. Okay, so those are the major points. We went over the anchor points, the arm path, and specifically the shoulder girdle motion. And then the last thing that I want to say is it's very important that you actually, with cable type motions, understand that there is going to be a very, very big distinction between you failing in the bottom, and this is sort of alluding to what we just talked about, and you failing at the top. So as you go through this range of motion, which you're going to notice, and I'll play the other angle here for you all in case you wanted to see it again, what you'll notice is that as you get into fatigue, you'll be able to pull toward the bottom for maybe, like, let's just say you could get 10 reps where you're going all the way to the bottom. But because it's a cable, and because the profile of the cable and how heavy the cable is relative to your strength will change throughout the range, and especially as you accumulate fatigue, what you'll end up being able to do is a bunch of partial reps toward the top. And so whenever I do these kinds of motions, I like to make sure that that really stretched position where my arm is high over my head actually gets fatigued, because if you don't sort of bang out those partials in that range, well, you potentially are missing out on a lot of, gains that might have otherwise been on the table had you fatigued that range. So that would just be my one bit of advice. I would only really advise that to people who were comfortable with the full range first. I wouldn't just jump right into the partial stuff. There may be issues in you just sort of jumping straight there to begin with. So make sure you have the skill, make sure that you're really controlled and intentional about, again, all those things that we already talked about, the anchor points, the arm path, etc. And then from there, you can start to worry more about, like, okay, am I getting the last 0.1% of this range fatigued relative to the rest of it? So that's pretty much it for the single arm lat pull down. If you have any comments, questions, about this specific motion, please let me know. And yeah, hopefully that was a little bit of a helpful tutorial / visual there. And I hope to see you all in the comments if you have any questions or anything additional that you'd like to sort of add to the video that I maybe didn't touch on. Or maybe should touch on a little bit more thoroughly.